Dear friends, welcome to the program. We are committed to bring you together with local and global thought leaders to get more insights about how to cope with these uncertain times. Before we start, the usual reminder. Most of you may already know, but this stream goes live on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter simultaneously. And we gather the questions from our YouTube channel, chat bar. So if you want to ask us questions, please join us on our YouTube feed. Today, I'm more than happy to host a really multi-talented guest. Tim Kobe is one of the very few global experts on strategic and human-centric design. Following his marvelous career in Apple overseeing retail operations, Tim founded 8 Inc. and designed incredible experiences, services, and places for many companies, including Nike, Nissan, Virgin Atlantic Airways, and some governments. He's a really interesting person with a holistic perspective on human issues as well as design issues and experience issues. So without further ado, I would like to kick off the conversation. Tim, always great to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Great to see you.
So I always start with the same question with all my guests. How are you bearing throughout this COVID-19 thing?
You know, we're dealing with it, I guess, in phases. We have many studios around the world. So the studios in China, for example, were at the front end of the virus curve, obviously, first ones into lockdown, etc. And then our other studios, as time progressed, you know, went into those same curves, those same phases. And, you know, we're seeing now China coming out of the lockdown mode. We're still in lockdown. I'm here in Singapore currently in my apartment. But, you know, we're seeing it in phases across our business and in ways that we're able to learn a little bit from the experience in the previous market and be able to apply that into the next progressive one that's impacted.
Right. Now, nowadays, the buzzword is the new normal. So everyone is trying to understand what will be the new normal. So according to your opinion, what will be the new normal? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I guess the new normal, everyone's looking for more continuity. And maybe the new normal is a lack of continuity. That what we're seeing is that we're needing to be a bit more resourceful. We're needing to be maybe a bit more inventive. And the new normal is one that requires us to be able to solve problems quickly and be able to move quickly. So I think that's part of it. The general lack of predictability is to me maybe one of the things that's becoming the new normal.
And also it's good for design and innovative mindset as well, because I think it's a great time to challenge the status quo or challenge the assumption or to use scarcity and exceptions to be more innovative.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we've had an impact in our you know, strategic design business from the standpoint that initially the work was impacted as people went into the lockdown mode, but we're seeing a lot of activity right now by companies who are looking to kind of innovate during this time, and so we're suddenly getting very busy, and you know what's happening is I think something similar. We experienced this with Steve Jobs in 2002 when the dot-com crisis happened in Silicon Valley. We had a time where many companies were essentially dialing back their investment, dialing back their operations, and sort of riding out the dot-com crash. What Steve did was he said, no, we're going to double down on the R&D, and we're going to invest and use this as an opportunity to get ahead. And I think it's interesting. That's when the iPod and iTunes were created. That's when the foundation of the iPhone was created. So that there, you know, we've encountered a number of CEOs now who are stepping back and saying, you know, while the competitors are are maybe not progressing as quickly as we can we focus on innovation and figure out how to turn that up? We've seen that in many different categories, but that's something that I think some of the smart business leaders are focused on today.
Exactly, and also it is very important for CEOs and decision makers to both cope with the current situation as well as to plan for the next moves. So it is not only responding to what's happening today, but throughout all this mess, I think CEOs and all the decision makers should be sparing some time to think what's going to happen after all this cloud is gone. So it is not only response time, but I think it is also thinking about the next normal or the next phases that are going to come, not in a long period of time.
Yeah. Everybody's talking about it being essentially an acceleration to many of the kinds of conditions that that we were experiencing. We were going through many different transitions relative to digital and physical space, relative to human interactions. And I think that this idea that we're now in an accelerated transition into these new conditions is something that's maybe one part of this. The other part is there's probably a huge period of learning that we're going to be going through. I think that's one of the things that is particularly fascinating is the virus essentially teaching us a lot of things that we may have forgotten. And I think the fact that many people have been in isolation, we've gotten back obviously to closer connectivity with maybe our families through this in different ways. But I think we've also recognized and start to appreciate the fact that we're a social species and that we are missing interactions with one another. And that part maybe we'll appreciate and think about differently, coming out of the crisis.
Yeah, you always say that you are in strategic design business. So what is strategic design? What is the difference between the design concept we know?
Well, I mean, we tend to frame, I guess, the problems that we approach a little differently. Design thinking was a buzzword for a number of years as a process. Really it was the foundation of how you begin a design program. But the strategy part that we bring to it, I think there's something called a value creation engine, which we work with. We have a kind of proprietary way of framing every problem, and it has to do with beginning with human outcomes, then forming a strategy that delivers those outcomes, and then ultimately developing the tactic that supports the strategy that delivers the outcome. So many companies will approach a problem with a tactical type of solution, and it won't necessarily be generating value. By focusing on human outcomes, we tend to see business outcomes perform much higher because it's really about value creation versus, say, value extraction or other methods. So we try to frame effectively the approach to the problem in a different way, and that has a lot to do with appreciating the value of experience. The idea that we use experience as in the design across different experience realms is fundamental to how we work with companies.
Great. So also experience has been one of the buzzwords that we have been using for a while. So everyone is in customer experience thing, everyone is in employee experience thing. So why experience is that important?
Yeah, well, there's a number of fundamental reasons. I mean, if you look at again, every company exists in order to create value. If they're looking to create value, they have to understand what it is that the people that they're trying to connect with will appreciate, will pay for, will engage with. And one of the tools, I mean, you look at using design as a tool in many years with Apple or Virgin or other companies. These are companies who have fundamentally used design to help define a differentiating experience. So if you're looking at purely a competitive environment, differentiating yourself from your peers is kind of at the heart of this focus. And it means being really clear about what you stand for and then expressing it through all of your touch points. Today, if you talk about designing human experience, the idea that the design component is really what it does for people, that you're ultimately focusing on providing something with purpose. If you look at the human part of it, we have a tendency to want to classify one another in the scientific method. We want to give psychographic and demographic kind of profiles to everyone and try to make a formula that we think we can then replicate. But that's really a kind of Industrial Revolution era way of thinking. And the reality is people are more complex and far more interesting than that. And if you look at the things that drive their behavior, a lot of it can come down to psychological interactions as well as biological ones. And if you use experience then ultimately to drive that behavior, it's this idea that, many companies spend a lot of time communicating information. Unfortunately, the human mind, the way we operate, biologically, is the part that processes information is a different part than what stimulates behavior. So the part that stimulates behavior has no capacity for language. And so when we look at experience, then it's people find that through the research that it's experience that drives behavior rather than information. And so we tend to focus on then what are the experiences that we're creating for the clients, for the customer engagement, and ensure that it's laddering back through that value creation engine.
Great. So for a while, we have been writing many articles about putting people to the center, to the core of what you are doing. Either you are providing a service or you are designing a product. But when we look at the majority of the experiences, most of them are much more designed on efficiency, not human outcome, or not putting the person in the center. So do you think this COVID thing will make us change our minds about this? Because I think lots of the experiences are void now.
Yeah, well, I think you tend to see change happening in areas where the experience that people have, the experience we're having right now on this call, is a different form of the way we would have been interacting 6 months ago. And so I think the ability for us to understand that whatever that human interaction is goes down as the criteria that you want to look at when you're trying to connect with one another, with other people. And I think you look at businesses, this notion that we're shifting to experience. In fact, I think business structures have to be successfully oriented around the outcome of the customer outcome. Otherwise, I'm not sure what they're really focusing on, right? I mean, they're looking at maybe making a more refined operating system, but from a standpoint of creating value, if you're not focused on that, I think it becomes very difficult.
Okay, I have been receiving some questions, and I think the main mandate is shaping around going back to work and how will the retail spaces and shops going to be designed. So let's move to that domain, if you like. So I think it has been nearly more than a month that we have been stuck in our homes, and the news is saying that we are going to gradually open up by the end of May, maybe beginning of June. So people are about to go back to their offices. The retail businesses are about to open again. We will be seeing shopping malls getting opened. So when you consider this going back period, what will change? How this period should be designed, or what new experiences, what new styles, what new kinds of designs will we be seeing in workspaces and retail spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, what the virus has done is really accelerated conditions that have been in development to a large degree, and is pushing us faster maybe into change than we're comfortable with. The IoT market, for example, the Internet of Things market, they're projecting by It's by 5 years from now to be at $1.6 trillion business. So that's something like a 25% growth in IoT. That was pre-virus statistics. If you look at it today, I think you're probably seeing a lot of development in areas where technology, smarter spaces, more the ability for greater sensing and feedback is where people currently see market opportunities. I think other areas, if you look at residential, I mean, people who have been developing residential, buildings, commercial, residential real estate for commercial terms has probably started to consider the notion of live-work type of spaces today, as opposed to maybe where we used to have a separate commercial space and a separate residential space. So I think there's going to be some hybrid models come out of that when you think of terms of business opportunities around the environment in terms of architecture and interiors. I think the products and services that you're seeing a lot of people push forward with have a lot to do with how we interact both in physical and digital space. And most of the things that we're seeing coming out of that work is one that's dealing with a pure intersection of both physical and digital. That there will likely be very few physical spaces that aren't containing some form of digital accent or layer. And I guess the other thing is in communications there seems to be, as I'm sure you know, in the business and publishing and in other content creation businesses, there seems to be a lot more of a live channel type of existence going on. We're seeing some really interesting models being explored in education. The idea of a distributed education system now starts to fundamentally change the idea of a destination campus and a structure around communication that is maybe more dynamic and more flexible.
Great. There were a couple of questions regarding the retail spaces, and some questions are in much more broad perspective. I'm saving them for the end of our conversation. But one of our audience is asking, what will be the future of flagship store concept? So we see lots of flagship stores around, from telecom operators to apparel companies. So is it going to be a better world for flagships or a worse environment?
We've seen a spike in work around flagship stores actually in the last few months, and it was a bit surprising to us. But the idea of the flagship store being perceived as a primary brand touchpoint and being able to be the element that communicates with the most impact, what your brand or your company is about, is something that I think people are seeing as a really valid way to invest in their relationships with their customers. They see a lot of migration in the intermediate channels to solely digital types of interactions, but in the flagship spaces, we're seeing an enormous amount of content creation, an enormous amount of physical and digital space type of interactions. And as a result, I think the opportunity for more breadth and more sales conversions for flagships. So, that happens to be what we're seeing right now and is of particular interest to a number of our retail clients.
Great. So the other thing that we are trying to better comprehend is the behavioral changes in consumer, or the changes in consumer behavior. We have seen lots of people going online, shopping online that didn't used to do that. But what kind of changes do you observe in customer behavior, and how much of this is going to stick?
Yeah. I mean, we were chatting about the idea that when China lifted the quarantine, Hermes had a $2.7 million sales day, which meant there were a lot of pent up purchasing power behaviors that some wealthy people were holding on to, I guess. But the idea that the experience component of this, it will go away. I think we've seen almost the inverse of when they decompress a location, take it off of the lockdown, that people are immediately drawn to one another, and I guess that was the case, particularly in cities in China where they had been essentially deprived of social interaction, and that was one of the first kind of cravings. And they wanted to get out in nature, and they found that everybody was also going out and getting into the natural environment. You see photographs of the Great Wall and others, but I think there's part of this, as I mentioned, kind of an era of learning, is it has to do with the way that we think about our social interactions. That we start to understand that we fit into a context that's bigger than ourselves or bigger than our families, and when deprived of it, we feel something. We feel that there's an impact, to our happiness and to our comfort.
Great. So, how about our way of working? We have been working from home for a while, and I have received some questions that is it going to be a permanent one, or will we be seeing more and more move to remote working?
Yeah, I mean, I guess at a kind of purely functional level, there have always been people who can work somewhat in isolation. But a lot of our business relies on teamwork, and so it's a question of how do you form those teams in a disconnected way, and are they as productive and effective as they are when they're together in the same space? And I think that this particular condition, there's a lot of focus on it. I'm sitting in Singapore where SARS in 2003, I think it was, it had a huge impact on the disease. I think there were 8,000 deaths here, but the idea was that, if you would have asked someone a year ago if SARS had impacted or changed their behavior, I think most of them would have forgotten about it. So I think we also have a tendency to, it's a bit like childbirth. We have a tendency to block out maybe some of the pain and only remember the pleasantries. But to me, I think some of the behaviors, we're pretty slow to evolve our behavior, and I think that there's going to be a fair amount of shift into a new normal, but that everyone, unless the disease continues to resurface over the next few months, I think you're gonna see a kind of short-term memory condition with some of it.
Yeah, as you had already mentioned, design thinking is one of the popular concepts or buzzwords that have been around for many years. But we were always writing articles and pushing leaders to be more and more design-minded, which is empathizing or ideation or ability to reframe or ability to tolerance failure. Do you think this time will teach these leaders to be more and more design mindset, or how may this design perspective, holistic look for a design with a design lens, may help leaders to cope with that uncertainty?
Well, I think a lot of people maybe don't fully understand what design is. A lot of people think design is a certain look or feel of something. And ultimately, design is about human outcomes. So if you're a good designer, you're not just creating something with a particular form, with a particular material, but you're doing something that has purpose. And in creating something with purpose, that emphasis on design, if it's focused on human outcomes, is very relevant. If it's focused purely on an aesthetic kind of consideration, then I think it has maybe less opportunity to create more value for the company, but also ends up being ultimately less relevant to people. So they're obviously related. I think the idea that you consider a design process and are successful at engaging in things that demonstrate empathy, that leverage opportunities or insights that you may have relative to creating value for people, that's still a pretty strong competitive advantage if you're looking at from a business context perspective.
Right, and also we see lots of companies or entities coming together to work on these COVID areas. We see pharma companies that are already competing each other to come join forces and to work together for a vaccine solution. Or we see lots of different industrial companies coming together and trying to manufacture ventilators, for instance. Is it a good chance to see that we can either collaborate and we can also be in competition and in collaboration at the same time? Do you think this mindset will stick after this COVID time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there should be a natural tendency to respond to conditions that obviously have larger scale, whether it's global or national kind of scale. Ford is one of our clients we've worked with for a number of years. The idea that their manufacturing structure and system is set up to pivot rapidly to producing masks and ventilators as opposed to F-150 trucks is kind of a testament to where new manufacturing practices have gone. I know that Samsung is in a similar type of capability, in the sense that they're able to pivot their manufacturing to the next thing when they don't really know what that next thing is. And so the idea that you're the new normal being designing for change and rapid flexibility, it allows you to partner in some cases with maybe new business opportunities you weren't able to when you had a more static type of organization or manufacturing capability.
All right. And also, we are seeing lots of innovative ideas and innovative designs and innovative way of working coming through this COVID thing. And you mentioned that IoT is one of the areas that are about to be accelerating after and during this COVID era. What new innovations could we see in the upcoming short future?
Well, I guess there are probably a number of areas. I guess the whole idea of social distancing and air travel is going to be an interesting one. We're seeing some examples in AirAsia. They're essentially fully encompassing their staff with protective gear. The idea that the seat spacing is what it is in most airlines may completely transform the way we consider air travel. But I think that it somewhat depends on the condition. But I think mobility is one area where, again, there's been transformation. This has probably now been accelerated. And if you look at home or office sensing and information feedback systems, being able to recognize and monitor, pollutants or hazardous materials. I think there's a lot of work being done in sensing and remote sensing. That sensing is also something that's very interesting in terms of data acquisition and gathering, distributed information. So I think that some of these systems that have been in the works are going to be accelerated as a result of this time that we're going through.
Yeah, and also it is obvious that we will be much more looking for opportunities in areas like artificial intelligence that will help us for better decision making, and we will be seeing physical digital convergence, as you have already mentioned in retail area, and we will see omni-channel strategies increasing. I guess the experience will include both digital and physical at the same time, and it will be a really interesting times for consumers and for retailers to cope with this new behavioral style, or with this new term, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things is the idea that we're seeing some breakdown in the trust of different leaders, right? And in the U.S., it's particularly the case where different states have completely different opinions about how they should manage the population and the virus. But it raises, I think, some interesting questions about large scale governed bodies of people anyway. And I think this is one kind of fascinating piece, that maybe those large scale systems, whether it's the former Soviet Union or the United States currently, or China or India, maybe this large scale is less relevant and less valuable to people. And that's, you see incredible success of smaller nation states. You look at how South Korea performed, UAE, other places. There may be something about a smaller organization of people is a bit more manageable. I know Governor Newsom in California was talking about California as a nation state. When you start to think about the diversity of opinions and the diversity of leaders, it's a question of really can a system support the scale that some of the more kind of super governments have. Obviously, there's examples throughout history of large empires collapsing, but I think that it's kind of fascinating to look at it from the standpoint of how are we controlling trust, and are people making decisions that are rooted in the best thing for their constituents? And I guess the corruption and some of the other things that we're seeing happening, is it pointing to kind of a collapse of larger scale systems? And that might be something to consider, particularly when you look at the mega tech companies and the scale. And I just think there's some fascinating dynamics going on with respect to scale and how those large scale elements interact with us.
Right. And also there is a huge debate going around being safe versus privacy. We have been talking about tracking apps, tracing apps, and it's becoming a big deal. So what's your take on this? Should we sacrifice some of our privacy in order to stay more safe and secure in the upcoming years, or there is another way of doing that?
Well, I think you don't mind doing it if you're sacrificing it to someone you can trust. The problem is trust, and I think that has to be transparent enough and demonstrable enough to where you can actually build trust. Andrew Ng at Stanford talks about artificial intelligence being a bit like when we developed electricity. You didn't really know what the possibilities were, and most people are concerned that artificial intelligence is going to replace their job, but I think in a way it's a false polarity, that what we should be worried about are the people who control the artificial intelligence, and how can we assure that it's part of the commons versus those who might tend to use it to exploit the many. And so I think that when you look at the leaders in artificial intelligence, half of them are governments, and some of them are large companies. And so do you today feel comfortable with trusting Facebook enough with that privacy or with that information? I think it's a legitimate question, because you start to see behavior of certain companies, maybe not necessarily reflecting your interests. So, that's where I think artificial intelligence is both an incredible opportunity and also a concern in the way that we track and manage that. So I think it opens up a lot of questions to me around trust.
Right. And there is someone in our audience who has done her homework very well. She had a quotation from your recent keynote. You said, people care about what makes their lives better. So what will people care from this day for the experience of lockdown? What will they care after this lockdown ends?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to learn. I think we're going to learn to care more about humanity, and probably we're going to learn to care more about our environment. And those aren't just sort of political perspectives. I just think that the things that have purpose in our life today, we're looking at and questioning every aspect of it through this lockdown, through this virus kind of processing, the amount of time that we spend with our children, the amount of time that we spend with our parents. I think these are all things. One of the most interesting things was seeing the towns in Italy come out onto the balcony and start singing, together as a way of sort of celebrating, the common condition that they're in, but also as a way of cheering up people and kind of, pulling each other along through this crisis. And I think we start to find some value in our social relationships that maybe we had lost somewhere along the way. So to me, it goes back to purpose, and then we redefine what is purpose in our lives coming out of this crisis. So my mother's an astrologer, so I could give you a long description of what she thinks is happening. But the fundamentals are, I think, that we're going to question our value system, question our humanity, and questioning the environment that we live in.
Okay, great. So a question about the leadership skills. What do you think on critical leadership skills that will be needed to thrive in these times of change?
I think leadership is really needed. We don't see it everywhere, and it has to be rooted in, I think it has to be, simple, honest, and relevant. The idea that we need to be able to look at conditions and look at it with a clear understanding of the reality. Certainly, the science behind the virus has taught us a lot about things that we should or shouldn't do. But I think having intelligent leadership, having responsible leadership, there has to be a certain degree. Politicians, it's good that they're boring in a way. They should be measured. And I think that when we see what's going on in terms of the impact from the virus, I just think that we're seeing people emerge as leaders. I think the Prime Minister in New Zealand, she's done a fantastic job through this time. She would spend time on both on Facebook as well as on sort of public broadcasting systems, but she would spend time explaining to children what was going on and spend time explaining to adults in the country what was going on. And she managed it, I think, in a really extraordinary way. I think she's a remarkable case study in leadership during this time. And I would look for those. I think Andrew Cuomo has been pretty remarkable in his management in New York. And there are people, I think, people who step up as leaders who maybe weren't considered leaders previously. That it has a lot to do with the kind of degree of measured responses that you demonstrate, kind of a soberness, a certain responsibility, to the greater good. And I think when you see people doing that, you you really start to understand them as leaders, and they can, you know, they can exist. I have a friend who's a musician, and because he's a musician, the only thing he could do is make more music, and he's done a lot of really interesting things during this time of bringing other musicians together. But it's funny how we fall back to some of the humanities in this time as ways of thinking about you know, the things that lift us up, that inspire us, that keep us moving forward. Otherwise, we're sort of living in Groundhog Day.
A couple of questions about your experience and your future strategy. How are you and 8 Inc. affected from this? And what will be the change in your way of looking to design after this COVID?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've been talking a lot about it as a group. I mean, I think if you look at our company, it's really sort of a collective group of people who are trying to solve complex problems. And if we are dedicated to you know, helping to define the, you know, human progress, then what can we be doing, given our skills and our experience, to kind of move that forward? And so, you know, we've been looking at different ways of engaging, both, you know, through media, but also with people who maybe were clients in the past or have never been clients, but have kind of new conditions emerge, you know, within their business. Many of the problems that have been created, you know, we've effectively created. Therefore, we have the ability to do things to correct those problems. And so I think what we're trying to do is to find new scopes of work that can have you know, impact on the largest number of people, but do it in a positive way. So, you know, for us, it's you know, we look at solving problems every day. So nobody comes to us with a solution; they always come to us with a problem. So we try to maybe reframe the problems in some way that helps us you know, move things along.
Yeah, I think reframing is really the key word to cope with all those problems and challenges that we are experiencing throughout these days. Another question was about B2B marketing. It reads like this: concepts of new normal in B2B marketing world from a design point of view, how it's going to change?
Well, I guess if you think of it in marketing, I would step it back a bit to forms of communication. And you know, we've found in you know, different examples of business climate, there's been a consistent growth in the ability to create stronger relationships in various forms of media, but doing it through kind of 4 key areas. And what we try to do is just to think about the touch points or the interactions that a business may have with, let's say if it's a B2B condition where an existing business, we have a client who's a large cycling component manufacturer, and they don't sell any of their products except to you know, cycling shops, to third-party businesses who then put together the bikes and sell the bikes. But the types of things that they can do in terms of setting up and strengthening the cycling communities, in setting up and having the interests that the cyclists have become a feedback loop in their development, in their conversation, is something that I think has been quite interesting. And you know, these 4 areas that I was talking about have to do with essentially what are emotional drivers in any relationship. So whether that's a B2B or B2C, I think, you know, you're looking at businesses are built on relationships. And so understanding the key components to a successful relationship is what ultimately will lead to, you know, to sort of ongoing engagement. And how you market that, I think, you know, you do it in a way that it has to come from that idea that I mentioned earlier, which is be simple, be honest, and be relevant. Those those three kind of filters we use a fair amount when we look at any kind of solution.
Another question is about the communication and design strategies for governments or countries. Do you think countries suffering severely from COVID-19 will need better communication and design strategies? Because as much as I know, you work with some governments on that. And we see in some Middle Eastern countries, there are even chief design officers in governments in order to design for a better future. So from the lens of communication and design, do you think countries need a better perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting dynamics, obviously, depending on the country or the community that you're addressing. In many countries in the Middle East, and we have an office in Dubai, we do work with the Dubai government. They're one of the few governments that I'm aware of who have, a minister of happiness. They have a minister of artificial intelligence, but they have some different takes on the way to think about serving their population. And to me, it's quite fascinating what that represents. And a big part of it has to do with a relatively young demographic of their population. And in the Middle East in particular, there's a number of countries there who have younger constituents. I'm here in Singapore. Within an 8-hour flight, I think we have 5.5 billion people, in a radius from where we're sitting, and that's out of the 7.7 in the population of the planet. So what's interesting there is that the majority of those people are under 30. And I think that the idea of structuring a government that's relevant to those younger populations is critical for the systems to be successful. And I think it's fascinating to see what the UAE has done, relative to that, and the kinds of things they're doing to make a more engaged both government and population.
Right. Another question is about startups. I'm going to tweak the question a little bit. After this COVID thing or during this COVID thing, do you see startups becoming more and more important, or lots of the solutions and ideas coming from startups, or much more incumbent and established companies?
There was a piece that Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz, he wrote recently that was calling for a super aggressive investment cycle to follow. And he built a pretty interesting case for what has been essentially a pullback in venture capital and many of the systems that have fed the startup communities. And he was essentially stepping out and saying, no, this is the time to innovate. This is the time to really push. And I think it's a bit like what we experienced with Steve at Apple, where it's what you do in this time. And I don't know that whether it's established companies or whether it's startups is so much the point, I guess. I think the point is, are you taking whatever resources you have, financial, intellectual, human capital, whatever it may be, are you making the most with those resources that you have, in this time? And I think how you classify it is something you do, kind of post innovation. But I think that you put together, hopefully, the smartest people you can gather, and you focus on solving big problems. I think that there are plenty of problems. There's no shortage of challenges that we have. So in a way, it's a very good opportunity to be investing in the intellectual capital.
Great. So let's move to that broad questions that I have saved for the last. I will just ask some brief answers for that because we are running out of time. One of the questions is that what would you recommend to someone who wants to become a designer under these current circumstances?
I would say do it. I think it's a fantastic path to pursue. I think it teaches a lot of qualities that you need in the future, particularly as it relates to being able to recognize and understand, you know, how creativity can improve things. You know, I'm a big advocate of design. I'm a big advocate of education. You know, to me, it's one of the few things that I think I'm always been asked to compare, you know, creative process with artificial intelligence, and that will creativity be consumed by artificial intelligence? And I think that it's one of the harder things for someone to reverse engineer. That the things that if you're a good designer, you tap on your experience, you tap on completely disassociated things and bring them together to help create new things. And to me, having the mental capacity to deal with that is a huge advantage in the future. When I think about design, and you know, all design is about change. One of the professions in the world that's the most comfortable with change is the design profession. And so, you know, we're used to doing that because every design should be changing something. And so if you are in a mindset in the future of having the skill sets to deal with change and to think about them in terms of framing them around the human outcomes, I think you're in a role or profession, whatever you want to call it, that will be incredibly valuable, because you know, it's the linear thought that can be easily replicated, but nonlinear thought is much harder.
One of the questions is, how do you focus while you are working from home?
How do I focus? You know, I guess it's obviously it's much more difficult. I have 3 children in the house, so the biggest challenge is coming up with what are we going to do with them today, since they can't go outside and enjoy themselves. So you know, the first step is to make sure that we've got something lined up for them to do that was different from yesterday, and yeah, and then I go find some time to jump on the computer and do things like this. So yeah, I guess as I said, it feels a bit like a, you know, rinse repeat kind of thing every day. So it's the hardest thing is the monotony of you know, repetition. You
are one of the most frequent flyer and traveler I have ever met, so I think staying at home for a while will be somehow good for you, I guess. And the other question is that's the interesting one. If you could meet one person in history, who would you meet and why?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I've been really fortunate to meet a lot of really interesting people in my life. So I've been pretty happy with the opportunities that we've seen. If I look back in history, I haven't really thought about that premise, just because I haven't found it to be that possible. But you know, I would probably go back and try to meet people who have been leaders, who've been in difficult situations and have managed to find a way out. I don't know who that might be. I mean, when I was a kid, I was young enough to, or I'm old enough to have remembered John Kennedy assassination in the U.S. And I think that you know, some of the things that he dealt with, he had some interesting insights. But I don't know that he would be someone I would go back in history for. If it was going back in history, it would have to be I don't know, pretty far back, I guess. So I really don't have it.
Yeah. And the final question, I always really want to learn your point on this. How was it like working with Steve Jobs?
Yeah, the thing I would say about Steve is you know, every week for essentially 12 years, and with the exception of holidays and illness, when he was away, we got to know him fairly well. And a lot of people have been critical that it was difficult maybe to work with him. And a big part of the challenge in working with Steve was he was incredibly strong at both linear thought and lateral thought. So if somebody came to him who was very good with logic, he could go through a logic tree, find a bust in it, and send them out. But if they made it through the logic tree, then he would look at it much less from an analytical side, but much more from an intuitive side, and say, it just doesn't feel right, go back and start over. And people who were really good at linear thought struggled when somebody told them that it just didn't feel right. And people who were really good with it doesn't feel right would struggle when he would find a kind of a bust in the linear thinking. So anyway, he was very, I think, ambidextrous in the sense that he could toggle between those two things. And most people are strong in one way or another. And I think it made it difficult because he was really strong in both ways and could easily debate you or test your hypothesis, whatever it may be, in a way that could would frustrate you if you were primarily a linear thinker or primarily a lateral thinker. But to me, he was a customer experience savant. He looked at things with the human outcome in mind, and ultimately that's been a great inspiration for us, as a company.
Great. So Tim, thank you very much. We are just running out of time. It's always a pleasure to have you and get your tap into your experience and ideas. Hope after this thing, we will be seeing you in person in Istanbul again.
I hope so. I can't wait.
Okay, dear guests, thank you very much for joining us. I think design is one of the very powerful tools, or design mindset is one of the very powerful mindsets that we can use as a leverage throughout this uncertain times. And what we tried today is to bring up some flavor to that thinking. So thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned. We will be there with new guests next week. So take care.